Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm Deborah Davidson, Director of Catalyst Conversations. This is our second program in the Fall 2020 series of Virtual Catalyst with Andrew Yang, who last connected with Catalyst in 2016 for the program Theories, Things, and Creatures with the wonderful Harvard butterfly researcher Naomi Pierce. We are asking our participants what they're up to, how their respective Catalyst conversations have stayed with them, and what they are dealing with in the current moment. This evening, I am pleased to continue that conversation with Andrew Yang, biologist and artist. And of course, this is different from our normal programming, as the focus will be all on you, Andrew, as well as being in conversation with me. Andrew beautifully states, if nature is a hypothesis, then we are a makeshift contraption to experiment with both science and art practices. He expresses his curiosity in the natural world through making objects, installations, and texts as a means to meaning. He works across the visual arts, the sciences, and natural history to explore the cosmological flux. Through sculpture, images, and writing, he explores connections between the theories, things, and creatures that teem throughout the ecology of experience. This is where I got the title for that earlier Catalyst program. He has exhibited extensively both nationally and internationally at venues including the 14th Istanbul Biennial, Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Spencer Museum of Art, and the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. His writing and research appear in journals including Art Journal, Leonardo, Biological Theory, and Antennae. He is an associate professor in the Liberal Art Department at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the inaugural artist in resident at the Yale and US College in Singapore, and a research associate at the Field Museum. Andrew is now going to show some of his recent projects with us, and we'll have a conversation following that discussing some of the projects Andrew will share with us. You can join in through chat or by raising your hand, and Molly Aiken, our co-director, will be on hand for that.
Hi everybody, can you hear me? I've unmuted, hopefully it's coming through okay. Thanks so much to Catalyst Conversation, Deborah, for inviting me back after some 4 years now. It feels like such a shorter period of time than that, so I really look forward to having this chance to talk again and catch up on different projects. So I'm going to run through a number of projects I've been working on this past year. And let me just share screen real quick. And, you know, I always like to start with a self-portrait. This is a photograph of the Earth taken by NASA. And I think one way to summarize sort of the work I've been doing, especially in this last year, the various projects, is sort of the phrase, what on earth? And that's in the sense of like, what on earth, in that sort of both confused, curious, and overwhelmed sense. But it's also this sort of what on earth, to really take the idea of the earth and groundedness and the planetary very seriously as the place that we are. Because there's, you know, whatever Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos might try to sell you, this is our only home for the foreseeable future. And, you know, eco means home in Greek, logos is the study of, and so ecology is the study of home. And I was also trained as an ecologist, and I think the question is, you know, we need to re-engage ecology beyond our standard models and in ways that sort of extend both who's part of that conversation and how we imagine that. This is a thing from the New York Times, an article I just saw 2 days ago on Monday that said climate disruption is now locked in. The next moves will be crucial. And then without missing a beat the next day at the UN, China announced that it will pledge to be carbon neutral in 2060, right? That this is their next step. It is a big deal, but is it big enough? Another headline about the same thing said China promises to do more about climate change, tackle climate change, and the thing is more. And you know, this is the kind of interesting language that I think us Earthlings are having to grapple with all the time with these big questions like climate change. Well, what does it mean big? What does it mean more? So I just wanted to mention a project that I actually just got the photographs for a couple minutes before the talk, an installation that I have up right now in Chicago. Oh, and one more, like 350.org, which is the name of a really important climate action organization. All of these numbers, all of these magnitudes, 2060, 400 parts per million, 350 is actually what this is named, parts per million carbon dioxide is what this organization is named after. How do we wrap our heads around this and sort of make it evident in different kinds of ways? All of this data, these reams and reams of data that are trying to tell us something pressing about our actual embodied lives. And so this installation that's right now up at the Glass Curtain Gallery is about, it's called Parts Per Million Planetary Aspirations, and in which I've actually silk screened 1 million dots, each dot representing one molecule of air in our atmosphere. And then a small subset of, so there's the 1 million dots altogether in the space, with on this notebook in the middle, the 415 carbon dioxide molecules that are actually driving all of this global climate change, to really sort of help us try to visualize something that otherwise is really impossible to visualize in terms of magnitudes, but also in terms of this weird impact that's paradoxical, that such a small number of molecules can have such a large influence. And I think that that's both a physical fact, but I think that also might be something that can operate as a political metaphor. We're facing something overwhelming that demands big change, but honestly, I don't think anything that we do is small enough. Every action is big, and every molecule, be it carbon dioxide or otherwise, matters. So I'm going to run through a couple projects just really quick of what I've done the last year or so. And again, the question is, what on earth? And so I kind of, every time I'm sort of thinking about things, I'm thinking about what on earth. And one question has been, what on earth is natural? And so that brought me actually to Lowell this past year in Massachusetts, where I had been researching the natural history and the history of the plastics industry, because that part of Massachusetts is actually home to the plastics industry in North America. Going to lots of different plastics factories, interviewing plastic factory workers, seeing the combs and other things that they make, then trying to use vintage molds from the 1800s that had been buried in museums somewhere, and tried to work with UMass Lowell graduate students to fabricate new combs made out of biosourced plastic from corn in this case, rather than from fossil fuels, to sort of, again, open up this question, what on earth is natural, and what are the stakes in things being natural in the past and in the present, especially with a waste product that doesn't degrade easily. So that became, in part, an exhibition that was at these different UMass campuses for the exhibition Local Ecologies, that was curated by Kirsten and Rebecca. But that also involved going to and engaging with, people around. So Rocky Morrison runs something called the Clean River Project that actually goes and cleans up the Merrimack River from all the plastic pollution that's floating in it. And so another thing about that notion of ecology I mentioned is that whatever an artist is doing, in my point of view at least, the projects have to exceed just one's own creative activity. I think an ecological mindset of art really demands that we engage as many other kinds of stakeholders and activists and people who have expert knowledge I as an artist don't have, to really understand these problems in a more synthetic way. And Rocky has been on his own running this project for years to just literally build his own boats from scratch and clean up the river. So I worked with him actually to learn just a lot more as part of my research, but to also incorporate some of his own work. So these are actually water coolers filled with hypodermic needles that Rocky collected from the shores and the waters of the Merrimack River, and has filled up and created this sort of spontaneously interesting sculptural piece that I think speaks volumes to the issues around plastic waste, around addiction, around environmental degradation, but also all of the amazing efforts that people are undertaking to try to remediate that. And so we ended up at UMass Lowell actually able to include one of these water coolers as an artwork in the exhibition. And it's that kind of sort of aspect of participation that I think is really important to try to extend whenever possible in a project. Another thing I've been really asking a lot about is what on earth is history? This, on the right, you see a picture of a cuneiform tablet from Mesopotamia. That's 3,500 BC, where ancient forms of writing are sort of put into mud and then baked. So it's a tablet, it's a page of a book in a sense. But on the left, you have the bark of an ancient fern tree. That's 350 million BC. And in this place, you see these markings that living creatures have made on the planet and that sort of persist. And so we often think of history as something that's solely human, but it's also, of course, of the earth itself. At the same time, we are inscribing ourselves in a very particular way on the earth through things like the Anthropocene, through climate change, through pollution. This is a picture from a book called Theory of the Earth, Volume 1 by James Hutton. And he was the first one to hypothesize the earth actually was really old or was a regenerative body. And he also called the earth a book of nature. And so I really ran with that metaphor to think about what kind of text the earth might be and what that means. And when I was looking at this picture, it just struck me to what extent it itself looked like a volume. So much so that I decided to then make a work called Deep Time Library that sort of mimics the form of these geologic strata that are laid down in this way that Hutton shows. Now, this sculpture that's just a picture of me building it in progress, is actually a case that each leaf or page stands for 10,000 years of history. And that's considered about the 10,000 years is considered human civilization. And so this is actually a scale model of the history of the planet Earth. If each page is 10,000 years, then this whole sculpture ends up being 4.5 billion years of history, of which just one page represents our time as a civilization on this planet. So to try to get a sense of how do you visualize these completely ridiculous spans of time and our place in that. It was a project in Kansas, so I also worked with geological photographers on the work they've been doing to document the landscape over time, and then work to make sort of these virtual double exposure images of famous Kansas landscapes that have crumbled over time. In some cases due to natural processes, but in other cases due to also vandalism. And then recreating those themselves actually in the form of books to play with this book of nature metaphor. That was Cobra Rock, and this is Castle Rock. And these are, again, other ways to sort of create these famous geological forms in Kansas with this metaphor. Now, this also involves just a lot of work in terms of sourcing material. Where did I get about 10,000 books? That involves this question of waste again and avoiding waste. And so going to the university recycling center and taking weeks to sort through all of the different hundreds of thousands of books that they get that are being sent to the landfill on a monthly basis, and trying to repurpose them so they have another life. Because these books are literally becoming part of the earth. And we can recuperate them for a moment to actually also stand in as a sculptural kind of material. And to think about this relationship then, not just metaphorically, but actually materially, because all of this carbon in the form of this paper is getting buried. And then working with, in this case, I worked with geologists and the printmaking techniques that they use to actually print make with fossils and rocks themselves. And these are fossil trees from 300 million years ago, and to make books out of them. Now, in this Deep Time Library, which represents the history of the Earth in that time, you see these individual pages with different images. One is this one of a mother breastfeeding a child, and that raises the other question, what on earth is the body? I started the talk with a picture of the Earth, calling it a self-portrait, and Hutton himself considered the Earth itself as an organic living body, and so do I, quite literally, but also metaphorically. There's the metaphor of a Mother Earth that certainly gives life to us, but there's the physical reality of all of our bodies actually being made of the Earth itself and returning to the Earth. And so I also had the opportunity through the Kansas project to revisit some other work. This is a work I first did when I was at Lesley back in 2012, which is a portrait of my daughter, her atomic equivalent in all of the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen that would make up her body, measured precisely. So the only thing that's different is that the arrangement of those atoms. But if you were to arrange them in the appropriate way, of course, you would get my daughter or a human really similar to her. So after 7 years' time, it's often said that 7 years is the time that your whole body regenerates. I had an opportunity to remake this work, Stella stoichiometry, all things renewed. Now she's 40 pounds rather than 6 pounds, and recomposing her exact sort of material being but sourcing the items from other places. In this case, Legos, coal, industrial fertilizer, and really taking seriously this idea of what in the world is the body. Now, it's not just the human body, it's also the non-human body. I had a chance to revisit this past year a project called the Flying Gardens of Maybe, where I also would look at these birds that hit buildings all throughout North America, I mean the world, here's especially in Chicago, because they're confused by the visual characteristics of our architecture. In dying, though, these birds aren't just singular tragedies. The birds pass away, but they also take with them all the plants that they carry as seeds. And this is a bird's stomach, and this is a bird's stomach that's been opened and all the seeds inside. So trying to sort of make sense of the earth as a body that's non-human and human and very dynamic, because here within this bird's body are all of these plant bodies and the whole change of a landscape that's being altered by our own architecture. So I was able to collect new material, take photographs of seeds that are coming from individual birds. These photographs are actually at the Essex Art Center in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and will be at the Smithsonian later. And so taking the seeds from a bird like this, Swainson's thrush, and planting those very seeds in a handmade bowl, and seeing the plants that grow just from that very bird. Another question I've been really engaged in was, what is native? What on earth is native? This is an Asian carp, and my collaborator and I have been really interested in the Asian carp because it's considered a horribly invasive species all throughout the Midwest of the US and the Mississippi River. Sarah Lewison and I, here we are looking at an Asian carp and doing this field work, and they're so abundant, they're taking up the whole river. They're considered an absolute pest. No one likes them. They're caught and either thrown in the landfill, or they're caught and they're shipped to China for the food market there. But they're reviled and they're considered invasive and alien and unwanted immigrant, wanted always dead and alive. These are the posters you see if you Google invasive species. And we really wanted to reconsider what even this means, because the Asian carp is an immigrant in a sense, and especially at this very charged political moment of what it means to not be American or to be foreign. But this fish is not going to ever leave the US. In fact, it's naturalizing. And so when will this Asian carp become an American carp is kind of part of our question, because there's another carp called the European carp, now it's called the common carp, but that common carp came from Europe 100 years ago. So if a European carp can become a common carp, when can an Asian carp become an American carp? What are the ways that we understand these things about being native or not, and how can we make them part of our native ecosystem? And so we were really focused on a billboard campaign in which throughout Southern Illinois, where we tried to put forth this idea of the fish as not as something horrible, but as part of our natural ecosystem that is actually highly sustainable, very tasty, and the easiest wild caught fish that you can find. And so we would also sponsor carp dinners, where for people to sort of enjoy Asian carp in different forms, read these placemats that sort of educate you about the history of the Asian carp and its contested status as either an immigrant or a refugee or an invasive or an alien or a new native. We had carp kite workshops that then let us participate in different kinds of parades. This is the All Species Parade in Carbondale, Illinois, and really try to basically do a campaign that, again, invites people to participate in their local ecologies more intimately, but also, and in a fun way, but also tries to reset the ways that we think about all of these interactions. There's also was an exhibition and museum component to that project. And then finally, I just want to close out real quickly with what is on Earth is culture, or what is cultured. And that led to the last project for this year, which was a 7-month artist in residency that my partner and I did collaboratively in Singapore. And so it was themed around the concept of the garden and what is a garden on different scales. Singapore is called the Garden City, but the garden itself is also not just an idyllic, picturesque place of beauty, it's also a place of control. After all, that's why Adam and Eve got kicked out of the garden, for breaking the rules. They ate the apple from the tree they shouldn't have, and that's the punishment. And so we wanted to look at the very complex realities of what it means for something to be a garden. So these are just some collages actually I made from the In-Flight magazine on our way to Singapore on Cathay Pacific, sort of imagining this garden in this sort of classical Chinese scholar's garden point of view. But then actually visiting as many gardens as possible. In Singapore, we were very interested in because of the community garden culture there. There's over 1,300 community gardens in Singapore, and people are very active in that interface with nature, even though it's such a densely suburban country. And so we want to really look at this relationship of nature and culture critically, and also the colorization of the city. So Lee Kuan Yew, its prime minister, had a very specific idea that to make Singapore more global and more attractive, they should import as many plants from other countries as possible that would help enhance the color of the city. And so that was the basis of a series of works that I've been developing around taking, again, fallen leaves that were basically trash, that were being thrown away or incinerated, and sort of recolorizing them. And thinking about this idea of what constitutes sort of beauty, what constitutes an ecology. But first, I want to say this isn't just sort of a practice of making these objects. All of that work, just like the projects I mentioned, are based on a lot of intensive interviews, in this case with local gardeners and activists all along the way, that inform our ability to, as a collaborative, to understand this ecosystem and try to engage with it. So these are different permaculturalists and community gardeners and activists that we talked with. And it involves sometimes breaking a rule or two, climbing a fence, to engage people where they are and find them and really learn about a site as intimately as possible, even if you're a visitor. And so I think I'll end there for now and get into a conversation.
Thank you, Andrew. I love the way you think. It's, and I think as you've developed, it's just getting sort of better. You know, your relationship to the world, to the earth, and to your own project, and you know, kind of, I mean, I see all the work as a kind of big social justice project. And I have a, you know, as I always do, some prepared questions, but I thought maybe we could sort of start out of order. And answer, you know, what I pose is, has your Catalyst conversation stayed with you? And I yesterday looked again at the conversation you had with Naomi Pierce in 2016, and you talked about two things stood out to me: the ideas of mutualism and manipulation, and the idea of making visible what's invisible. It seems to be very pertinent to you all the time. So maybe you could relate those ideas to Flying Gardens of Maybe or anything.
Sure.
So
yeah, I mean, and I talked about the Flying Gardens of Maybe project with you and Naomi back then 4 years ago, and it's been an ongoing project. And so I had a chance to revisit it because of the Smithsonian exhibition. They actually invited me to go to the Natural History Museum and collaborate with the bird lab there to collect seeds from local Washington, D.C. birds. And then do a new series of photographs that would connect to those seeds that we could also plant. So when that exhibition might open, there should be both plants and photographs and like sort of all these different components of the project. But yeah, in terms of making the visible invisible, I mean, if you wake up early enough, you'll definitely see these birds on the sidewalk during migration season. But again, it's something that is so easily neglected and taken for granted. It's seen as something like, oh, well, isn't that too bad? And oh, well, that's a bird. And so, you know, part of the aspiration of that kind of project is to help reveal all the different entanglements and complexities that involves. It's not just a bird, it's actually a whole landscape of plants that every bird involves. And I think one thing that I want to mention there for visibility, you know, that doesn't always come out, but there's a large diagram that goes in the exhibition format of that project, and it highlights the Chicago bird collision monitors and the Field Museum, and it's with those groups that we collaborate, and the collision monitors pick up the birds and bring them to the museum, and the museum has generously allowed me to go through their trash and pick up the bird guts to forage the seeds. But there's then that process of making something visible to them and then making something visible to me in a participatory sense. So there's one thing that's just visual for an audience, but there's another aspect to that visibility that has to do with the art making project itself.
Right. And you know, the parallel, I mean, since you're kind of working in both art and science sort of almost simultaneously, you know, for scientists, I remember Naomi mentioned that, you know, there are technology and instruments that help scientists see what you can't see, you know, through microscope.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, you can also think of it as the metaphor of like what's inside, you know, a person that gets expressed, you know, as an art object. And then, you know, you just take that steps further. And, you know, I mean,
I mean, the geologist that I worked with, Rudy Serbet at University of Kansas, who taught me this printmaking technique where you cut a fossil and then you acid etch it and then you sort of can make a print. You know, we worked for months together, and then he finally came to the exhibition and saw it in this other format. He's like, wow, I never thought about how my work could be art. And the manager of the recycling center said the same thing when he came. And so, you know, there's this other thing too of sort of widening the circle of participation, because, you know, for better or for worse, art can also be both intimidating, but also excluding and not always inviting, right? And so making as much as possible a project to create other kinds of social ecologies, I think is always, you know, a wonderful thing to aim for.
Yeah. Let's see. Well, maybe you could talk about just, you mentioned your garden project in Singapore. Well, a couple of things. One is, I have been noticing so many articles and interest now in the time of pandemic in gardens and gardening. Gardening
Yes.
kind of,
yes.
you know, good for the soul, you know, mental health, and how oftentimes in times of distress and stress that people make gardens, you know, for many kind of reasons. So it just seems you've that's kind of part of
yeah. Well, I will say I just showed you a couple images. We're still unpacking the Singapore project because it's quite complex. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to say a little bit more about that, because yes, I mean, as I said, one thing that drew us there was the community gardens. Everyone lives in high rises in Singapore, right? There's very little space, and so community groups and the government are very interested in promoting people to garden. At the same time, space and land are very controlled. And so when you saw the picture of a friend of mine and I climbing over a fence, some gardens, some people, what they call guerrilla garden. They garden in places that are unsanctioned spaces by the government. And that can generate its own kind of conflict, but there are these then questions around, again, like the garden is a place where you engage with nature, but it's also a place where you control nature, where you prune it. And so one thing that happened during what they call the lockdown in Singapore is called the circuit breaker. Singapore as a garden city is highly manicured. And it's manicured largely by tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of migrant workers who do most of the maintenance and construction work in Singapore. When the lockdown happened, all of those migrant workers, along with everyone else, was locked in dormitories or their apartments. And so all of the gardening that would have been done in the city otherwise ceased for 3 months. And all of a sudden, everything started to get overgrown. And there were fields of tall grass, and there were weeds, and all of a sudden, all of these insects started to appear that some people had never seen in their whole life, because the garden city itself had never been allowed to sort of overgrow its manicured limits. So there was a lot of discussions I had with different gardeners, and that was showing up in the newspapers over like, wow, could we let things go a little wild? Like this would actually allow for a different kind of biodiversity. Maybe we don't have to have everything mowed constantly. Maybe we can give a little bit more of Singapore back to these other creatures. And so that's where it became a really interesting question around not just who takes care of the garden, but what are we trying to achieve? Certainly a sense of peace and engagement with nature, but on whose terms, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. That kind of fits into the mutualism and manipulation
Yeah, exactly.
had with Naomi, which is, the mutualism and manipulation between species, between, the plants and the bugs, but also between the humans and the plants and the bugs.
That's right. And I mean, that's certainly at the heart. I've written a little bit on this in terms of the Flying Gardens of Maybe and another project called Economies of Anachronistic Fruit that I do that also involves seed collecting. But in that, I talk about the fact that, of course, the birds and the seeds are in this mutualism, but the plant is manipulating the bird or the insect to try to entice it so that it will either pollinate or disperse seeds. But the bird is sort of making out with some, or insect with some food. But then the question is, like, as an artist, what am I doing? Like, I'm actually not that interested in, I'd never thought I was that interested in plants, but then I found myself spending all these hours collecting seeds on the ground and rummaging here and there. And that raised the question, like, well, I'm certainly manipulating the trees and the birds and I'm making art, but maybe the plants are just as much manipulating me. I'm spending all this time dispersing the seeds of these different plants, different places, the other project especially so. And so there's an aspect of mutualism that I'm certainly benefiting in doing that work with the plants, but then they're also manipulating me in very subtle ways that I probably am not thinking about. But somehow they've managed to monopolize all of this time and attention from me that I could spend doing other things. But of course, as a human, I think I have all the agency and I carry all the control. But I think, again, that's where these projects invite, hopefully, the possibility where you reconsider how all of those relations in nature are negotiated. And maybe we aren't actually as much in control as we really believe ourselves to be.
Yes. Here's a question for you. What are some of the changes in your practices due to the pandemic? And as we've discussed, like for all of us, everything has changed in this continued difficult moment. So just wondering if there was anything, specific or even non-specific about those changes.
Yeah, well, I will say, I'll show you, I zipped through those images at the very end. Two things I'll share really quickly. So one, I was doing just a series of these sort of collages in Singapore. And they started to change as the pandemic evolved. And it actually, hit, of course, Asia much sooner than it did the United States and North America. But let me see if I can find a good image here. Present. Can you see the screen now?
Yes.
So this is a detail of a collage I was doing called sort of Contagion in the Garden. And so I found one issue of Singapore Vogue from last year in the trash. And so I thought to myself, how many gardens can I grow sort of visually from this one, this one issue, thrown away issue of, oh no, it wasn't Vogue, it was Harper's Bazaar. And I'm very interested in the idea that plants and nature and flowers, appear so prominently in things like fashion magazines. But to then think about what that means, like the garden is this place of control, but COVID really made clear that, of course, that we really aren't in control. And so this image sort of shows different moments of fashion models now wearing masks, and these little dots that were polka dots from a dress are sort of the coronavirus particles that are sort of drifting through this garden city. Connecting to hands. You see hands appearing in different motifs. Here it's a hand in the negative space of the ocean waves. There's another person and two hands touching. And so the appearance of these hands and contact became sort of a bigger part of some of the work I was doing. And there was a video that's right now showing at the Spencer Museum of Art virtually that my partner and I collaborated that directly deals with that. Because I'll show it to you right now, but we started seeing hand washing videos in the cafeterias in late January. They were already taking measures to sort of try to mitigate coronavirus, and that's why, of course, they never had a severe outbreak. In a city of 5.5 million people, 27 people have died in all of this time. Whereas in Chicago, about 27 people die a day. And we're about the same size as Singapore. But anyway, so let me see if I can share this screen. And so it's a piece, a video piece called How to Wash Your Hands. Let's see if I can get it full screen. Can you see it?
Yes, fine. Mm.
Yeah, so that work really grew out of the fact that we were basically stuck in our apartment for 3 months, and really considering these questions of contact and of intimacy and of protection, and yeah.
And it was also like, I loved watching it. It was like watching a poem. It was like a poem in in process, you know, with the text and the hands, you know, as kind of like sculpture. You know.
Thank
I'm
you.
going to ask one more question, and then I just want to be cognizant of the time if, to invite our audience if anyone has a question for you. It's kind of a big question, but can you just talk a little bit about how your life and your practice mirror each other? You can,
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think for better or for worse, I think one way that a lot of my projects seem to mirror my own life is that a lot of them seem to deal with accumulation or with sort of retrieving otherwise discarded objects. Those might be the stomachs of birds, or those might be, you know, plastic detritus, or that might be a bunch of books that were being thrown away. Or these fish. And so I'm actually a bit of a, I won't say I'm a hoarder, but I have a really hard time letting that almost functional piece of furniture in the alley get thrown away, or that piece of food on someone else's plate in my family. Like I have a real preoccupation with waste in some ways, and with making use of everything. And I think that definitely shows up in my art practice in terms of always trying to be looking for an opportunity to reuse something or have it serve some other use before, you know, it goes into the landfill or otherwise. And so I think that drives my family crazy, but I think that that's definitely something that shows up in reflecting in my work. Another thing that I think maybe is less obvious, or I've only started to think about recently, but I showed you at the beginning these silk screened that was on paper of these dots. So that wasn't the plan, actually. So I installed that work in about 5 days, but paper was never originally a part of it. That was all going to be silk screened directly on a wall. And then I found out while I was there, because of the quarantine or because of the situation, I couldn't have any assistance, and I couldn't even visit the gallery ahead of time. And it turned out that I couldn't silk screen on the wall. The wall was too rough. There was no way to get a clean pull. And so I had to just like completely adapt immediately to change like what the format of that is. And that's generally the case too with a lot of these installational projects. I kind of play this weird game of chicken with myself in real life, in my normal life, but also the installations, like with the books, or with, I know there's another project that involves 7 tons of sand that I redid recently, but I actually don't know what the piece is going to look like until I start installation. And the installation window is always set. So I kind of try to, and I think I do that on purpose, even though it's nerve-wracking. I feel like I'm most creative when I put myself under pressure. And I notice that I do that in my regular life too, even though the stakes are lower than. So far it's worked out generally, but I find that, you know, I think those are psychological aspects though, more than anything else, that somehow appear in the art.
It's interesting how they twin, how they
yeah.
coexist.
Bad habits. Your bad habits follow you wherever you go.
I believe that the artists in the audience will kind of be nodding their heads like they get this completely, right? So does anyone want to have, comment or a question for Andrew?
You can either, just jumping in here, you can either place your question in the chat and we can read it out loud, or you're welcome to raise your hand and we can allow you to talk if you'd like.
Meanwhile, one thing I'll say to follow up on your question, Deborah, right before this, I just finished teaching 5 hours of a sculpture class, but we're mainly remote. And so the sculpture class is called Knowledge Lab Ecology Takes Shape. And we've had to completely change the class because it's mainly remote and only sometimes in person. When we're in person, we're outdoors. It turns out actually that one of my own students just the other day tested positive in that class for coronavirus. But since we were all masked and outdoors, there's actually, and we were distanced, none of us are at risk. I mean, we've all the due diligence about that's been done, but and so that whole class is actually being changed, and the projects that we're undertaking, it's a sculpture class, and so the question is, how has COVID and how has our conditions respatialized everything? If sculpture is the ultimate spatial practice, then the pandemic is actually an amazing opportunity to reconsider the terms of sculpture and ecological art. And so it's been super interesting to work with the students and see how they're addressing this, their own sense of like being penned in, their loss of mobility and certain kinds of freedom, but also the ways that they're trying to expand the way that they're doing artwork outside and inside with the pandemic, to comment on that, but also like embrace it as a constraint.
Yeah, it's very challenging, but it sounds like you're doing as well as you can. We have a question from Ellen Band. When you take installations such as the book installation apart, this is a good one. What do you do with the books, and do you restore them to build the piece again? That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. In the case of the books, there are 3 book sculptures, and so all of those books were sort of basically, the only books that I kept were the books in the one stack called Cobra Rock. That was like one singular stack of books. So that's been saved and that could be recreated. Everything else wasn't. It was, it was just too many books. There's no way to store or to send or anything. And the recycling center was happy to take them back because they basically get just shredded. Some of them get shredded and turned into actually insulation. Other ones are incinerated, other ones are landfilled. So the only thing I could do was basically keep them, give them another rest stop on their way. Although interestingly, I'll say, like, I had so many assistants, as you can imagine, for that project. And the collection of books that Sarah Pickett and I first pulled out, the 10,000 or so from the recycling center, were then stored. And as we did the installation, people would come by and it became basically a little library situation where people were picking books out, titles that they wanted. And so I ended up redistributing and myself getting a number of really interesting books that are like first editions that are very difficult to get, that were just being thrown away. So I really appreciate the aspect that that project's called Deep Time Library, but it literally for the 2 weeks of the installation period became a library for everyone who came through the museum and kind of sometimes pilfered my books.
Mm.
In other cases, like with 2 cases, I've done a piece called The Beach for Carl Sagan that involves about 7.5 tons of sand. The most recent version of version of that I did at the Museum of Contemporary Art of Chicago, apparently they stored the sand. And I'm not exactly sure what they're doing with it, but I was told that they stored it. In another case, I was told that Ursinus College, that's where I did it most recently, they were thinking of using it for their own grounds and work. So that they needed sand for their own landscaping. And so I really appreciate the idea that this inside set of sand dunes then became part of the campus.
This is just a practical question, but did you buy the sand?
In that case, the sand was bought. Yeah, when that piece I first did in 2016 in Chicago, and I wanted to source the sand from Oak Street Beach in Chicago downtown, which is only about 3 blocks from the Museum of Contemporary Art. But they were like, no, you know, this sand has to be clean and it has to be museum grade sand. And so it was purchased. It's basically sandbox play sand from Quikrete, but it has to be a very specific grade because the grain size of the sand and the number, it's 200 billion grains of sand because that's a scale model actually of the Milky Way galaxy. Right. And so the sand you get actually matters. So I had to shop around.
I missed a sentence that Ellen wrote, which I'll just say to you. It's a comment that the piece with the books that show the age of the planet is exceptional, a great visual for time.
Oh, great. Thank you.
That's a good comment. So we have, I guess people are not asking questions. So maybe I'll just, you know, moving towards the end here, that, you know, this is my feeling that the whole world has been rocked due to the pandemic, especially the art world. It's institutions, nonprofits, galleries, museums, schools, and of course, artists themselves. And, you know, I find it heartening that you have so much good energy, and that you're, you know, that you really, you know, your art making is continuing. And it seems like you also, that you, it's for lack of a better word, a coping mechanism for you. I think
yeah,
for
right.
us, I mean, my practice is that, you know, it's like kind of an imperative, you know, what are you going to do? You have to kind of hit back.
Yeah, I definitely feel that way. I mean, I didn't show that work, but actually a lot of the time in quarantine and or in lockdown in Singapore, I didn't show it, but I actually was doing watercolor painting, which I very rarely do. But it turned out to be the one piece of artwork I sold while I was there. So like, we were really interested in this painting of these dead leaves that I had been collecting on daily walks that I would sort of paint. And so it was an opportunity to return to things, right, that otherwise, if you're not given the time or space to do, and I found it really gratifying, but also important to have that chance. And I think that the pandemic is going to rock everything for better and for worse. It's a whole nother conversation about what it will do to art schools and to museums. And I think just as artists, we need to obviously take care of ourselves, and art can be therapy, but we need to take care of everyone else too. And maybe art will take on a completely different form, you know, and it makes me think of Meryl Letterman Ukeles right now in maintenance art a lot, actually, and what are the conditions of art? Art is what I call art, and or her manifesto for a maintenance art show I've been thinking a lot about, because that really reset the conditions for what contemporary art could be. And I think the pandemic's doing something like that, of course, on a much larger scale for everything.
Actually, another question from Miguel Sebastida. I said that. Andy, how do you find a balance in spoken jargon when you are addressing scientific content within an artistic audience? Another good question.
Right. I don't know. I'd love to know if Miguel thinks I do that successfully in terms of my own jargon, or I don't know if I do balance it very well. It'd be great to know, to get some feedback on that. I try to minimize the amount of like technical or specialist language I pick up from people. What's also a benefit is that, I have some scientific training, but most of the art projects that I do aren't in my field of specialty. And I think that's kind of intentional. I prefer to be an amateur in geology and physics, and these things I know very little about. Maybe it would be harder if I started doing projects about things I know a lot more about and I'm stuck in that language. But I think it's a great question, and I think it's a really good, it's a question of audience too. You talk differently to different people at different times, and that's fine. That doesn't diminish the work. It's just a different way to say the same thing sometimes, or it's a different way to say a different thing, because every audience is also different. So I'm completely open to that.
Deborah, this is Joe. I've taken over for Molly, and Ellen has raised her hand, so I'm going to.
We have another couple minutes, but Ellen, sure.
Hi, Andrea, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi.
Okay, this is such a wonderful presentation. I have a question about the work in Singapore. I've never been there. What I know about it is limited, and it's fascinating to know about it as a garden city. Mostly what I know about it is how strict the government is, about what people can do in public, like not chew gum and, things like, it's very, right. It has a lot of rules. So I'm wondering, do you have any sense with the pandemic and the overgrowth that is happening? I'm wondering if people are now seeing how beautiful overgrowth can be, and if that might change the government's attitude about everything being so precisely pruned, and like might certain areas be left to kind of go wild, and might others be kept very neat and pristine. Do you have any sense about that?
Oh no, that conversation, thanks Ellen, is very live right now. So commentaries and the channels, Channel News Asia or the Straits Times, those are the news outlets for Singapore, are addressing, there's lots of commentaries on exactly that topic, like, oh, let's let things go a little bit, let's not mow everything so intensively, let's not spray things. I mean, there's an interesting balance for people that we talk to, because there are good reasons, of course, for some of the controls. I mean, while we were there was a really large outbreak of dengue fever that was ongoing. That was probably more of a concern for most people, actually, more than COVID was. And so, and that's a mosquito-borne disease. And so they're like, oh, well, if you have more plants and more nature, then you've got more mosquitoes, and that's a problem. Or some people, we had a whole interesting set of conversations that, so Krista Donner, my partner and collaborator in the project, we've done a series of about 10 interviews with different kinds of gardeners that we're transcribing and are going to be part of a zine. But we kept raising this question about the tall grass, and some people are like, oh, well, tall grass means snakes, and our snakes are very venomous, and so we shouldn't have tall grass, because if you walk in you're going to be afraid because there could be a venomous snake there. And then, so we kept asking everyone we interviewed after that point, well, what about the snakes in the grass? And we got all these different opinions, and someone's like, what are you talking about? That's why you take a stick with you and you shake the grass in front of you. And, it's your fault if you get bit, because the snake doesn't want to mess with a human. And by rattling, one person who was doing forest play school work said, that's your signal to the snake, and that's their way of you sort of being invited into the grass. So you signal you're there, the snake will leave. And another landscape gardener I talked to said, yeah, well, I've been bitten 3 times by poisonous snakes, and I'm still here, and I'm still a gardener. That's just that's ecology for you. And so, yeah. But it is, sorry, but it's a very live question, and it's a live question in terms of this question of control, because you're right, compared to American standards, it's much more regulated and rule following. And again, a lot of the people we were talking to, they were pushing those boundaries, and they really wanted, through their gardening, they themselves were actually social activists, because that was one way that was sort of testing limits of certain kinds of control around space and around gardening and around wildlife.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we are at 7 o'clock. I want to thank you, Andrew, for so much, for spending time with us and sharing your projects and your thoughts. And it was just great to be with you and be in conversation.
Yeah, you too.
A little different from artists and scientists, but I think we did okay.
Yeah.
And I thank the audience so much for attending. It's great to have you. Want to let you know our next program is October 14th with author and dream researcher Deidre Barrett. Her most recent book is Pandemic Dreams. So she writes and thinks about dreams all the time, and she has collected 900 dreamers and what are they dreaming during this pandemic time, and so that should be super interesting. You can join our mailing list to receive announcements and check out our website, www.catalystconversations.org. And you can look at our past programs, including Andrew's talk with Naomi Pierce, which I recommend highly. And we have a series of podcasts as well. So thank you so much, and have a good rest of the evening, everyone. And again, Andrew, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and everybody. Take care. Be safe.